Viewers, today's topic of discussion is Ars Poetica by Horace, Roman poet and critic. So, what is the meaning of Ars Poetica?
Ars Poetica means art of poetry.
Because everything or something is prescribed here. It is a letter or epistle in verse form. It is a criticism and advice to two sons and a father on literary matters. It is a letter to Pisos, whose identity is unknown, perhaps Augustus Caesar's father-in-law. In this book, various rules are prescribed. So we must know first about Horace. His full name was Quintus Horatius Flaccus. He born in 65 BC and died in 80 BC. Augustan days, named after Octavian Augustus, the emperor of Rome. Octavius Augustus was a glorious man and glorious like Pericles in Athens or Greece, Ashoka in India, and Elizabeth I in England. Horace was influenced by the Greek critic or philosopher Aristotle, and he is indebted to Aristotle for many opinions or views. Aristotle lived before 2 centuries before Horace. Others contemporary of Horace were Virgil, Tibullus, Prophetius, Ovid, Livy. This period was called the Golden Age of Latin literature. Horace is a classicist. He is Aristotelian with some difference. Matthew Arnold said about him that of all the Roman poets, he was the best critic, and of all the Roman critics, he was the best poet. An epistle to Pisos family. And Quintilian, another critic, a later critic, he gave the name Ars Poetica to this epistle. Ars Poetica is written in 541 lines, and this book has 3 sections. The first one is poesis or subject matter of the poetry. Second section is poema or the form of poetry, and this poema or the form of poetry has 2 divisions. One is abstract form and another one is concrete form. The third part of the book is poeta or poet. Here advice to the poet or function of poetry. Now we should approach with the first part, poesis or subject matter of the poetry. He begins with the opinion of organic unity and propriety, or propriety means properness or exactness of the writing. What is the organic unity? Organic unity is the coherent unity. The parts are connected with the whole, and whole is closely connected with the parts. If part is affected, the whole is distracted. It is like the organ of the body. If one organ is affected, then whole body suffers. First 6 lines I am reciting from the poem to show how the poem, how the letter, how this book begins. If in a particular you should see a handsome woman with a fish's tail, or a man's head upon a horse's neck, or limbs of beasts of the most different kinds, covered with feathers of all sorts of birds, would you not laugh and think the painter mad? From these lines it is clear that the structure, the subject matter should be perfect, should wisely chosen. Otherwise the writing would be a writing of mad poet, like a painting, incoherent painting, and the painters, that is the mad painter's painting. Poet is free to indulge his fancy, he said, and imagination also must have the reasonable structure. Haphazard writing of imagination fancy is not allowed to him. Next he said about the harmonious unity between part and the whole. He said it, the organic unity. Chosen. If it is chosen correctly or wisely, apt words or exact words come automatically. And he said this line, sound judgment is the basis and source of good writing. He is wanting to say that one should choose a subject matter that is within his bound. It should not be beyond his bound. He said about poets' liberty, and he said poets are free to coin new words and revive old when absolutely necessary. When absolutely, not every time, necessary. Why the old ones absolutely when necessary is coined? Because old men are only working hospitals. He wrote this line. So when absolutely necessary, then only old archaic words should be coined, should be adopted. He said, language is like a tree, and words are leaves, which wither every year and are succeeded by new ones. He is advocating here to use those words which are very familiar to the people, to the readers. He is very much influenced by the Greek writings, and he said each particular genre should use the meter allotted to it by the Greeks. He wrote this line, be perfect in the Greek originals, read them by day and think of them by night.
We get the same idea in Alexander Pope's An Essay on Criticism, where he said, be Homer's works your study and delight, read them by day and meditate by night.
Exact subject matters. The writer should be very much familiar with the Greek writings, Greek classics, originals, and read them by day and think of them by night. Next, he said about poetic diction, advocated the proper choice of words and arrangement. Language of poetry should be different from common life. Language of poetry should be very much poetic. Choice of subject matter, theme should be very familiar to the writer also. Within his own bound, I said, and believable false is preference to the unbelievable truth. And here I can remember a line from Poetics by Aristotle, where Aristotle said, familiar unfamiliarity is better than unfamiliar familiarity. Next, I am going to second part, that is poema or form of poetry. Here we can get two forms, abstract and concrete. This part is about the structure of the writing. First he said plot, about plot. He said comic theme should not have lofty vein and seriousness, and tragic theme should not have low vein of comedy. To choose a perfect plot, follow Homer, and the plot should have beginning, middle and end, and every section should follow each other, one another logically, and characters should be true to life. They should not be untrue to life. He said, make first law plan to write, and according to your power and plan, go ahead and arrange your materials with a sequence, not haphazardly. He said, poetic style should be very good, not ordinary one, and expression should be comfortable. Poet must be sincere and very hardworking. And from here I am reciting lines from Tennyson. I think Tennyson had taken the idea from here. In Ulysses, Tennyson wrote, how dull it is to pause, to make an end, to rust unburnished, not to shine in use. Then he said, feeling of poet must be expressed exactly on the page. If you would have must first of all feel grief yourself. Then he is telling about the truthfulness of the mind of the poet. The poet must be very truthful of his feelings, of his imagination. He said appropriate meter for different genre of poetry should be used as prescribed by classicists, and that is the most beautiful and perfect style. Then he said about the tone in drama. He said, in tragedy and comedy, if same meter is used, differs in tone, differs the emotion, vary according to sex, situation, and social standard. In drama, in tragedy and comedy, if same meter is used, they differs in tone, they differs in emotion, and they vary according to sex, situation, and social standard. By the tone, one can realize it is tragedy, it is comedy. Then he said about the decorum. He said about drama more. He said drama is form of poetry without lyric, and a dramatist must know what is staged or what must be staged on and what to report to the audience. And he said ugly and horrible part should be reported to the audience and it should not be staged or in front of the audience. He said about the 5 acts of the drama, not more than 3 characters in one scene. God should not intervene in action if not absolutely needed. Denouement or chorus is the integrated part. And he said catastrophe should be the natural outcome of the preceding happening of the action. Chance, the supernatural, should be reduced. Events must logically follow each other. Characters should be true to life. He said about verisimilitude, and he here advocates the classicists by saying to follow nature is to follow them. Them means the classicists. This line we can get in the writing of Alexander Pope in his poem An Essay on Criticism. Next, I am going to tell or discuss the third section, that is poeta or poet. Here we get the advice to the poet or function of poetry, duty of poet and their quality. Poets should first prepare themselves to carry out the duty. Not hurriedly it should be published. And he wrote, keep your writings 9 years unpublished, then revised again. Let it judged by experienced and various hands. Language should be true to life. For example, a slave should not be given the language of a king. A woman should behave like women, not a man. A boy should speak like himself, not a mature one. Writer should have knowledge of wide and culture. His mind should be very broad. And the poets are free to imagine, but it must not degenerate to license. They should not imagine haphazardly anything. The poets should be very honest. They should not be greedy and corrupted and not be a damaged soul, because perfect and honest writings comes from the honest and perfect soul. He said about nobility and dignity of soul. Class of the writing should instruct or delight, or both. Art and training both are needed for good poetry. Wit and patience are necessary. Only the inspiration is not enough. Inspiration may be the source, and the practice, the training gives the perfection of that source. The poets should be the keen observer of men and manners. If they are the keen observers, they can write the very minute aspects of life. They should be very studious, and they should study much. Familiar words appear strange, and strange one familiar. And this is the art, this is the faculty of the writers to make such things. Aim of writing should be the mixing of pleasure with profit. He wrote the lines like, but he that joins instruction with delight, profit with pleasure, carries all the votes. That means if the writing has the mixture of instruction and delight, profit and pleasure, then the writing gets the support of every readers. The writing should be brief and avoid of unnecessary things. That means he is speaking here about the propriety, exactness. He said writers should give the sweet language along with the useful one and unite agreeable and the profitable. Next he said minor faults in poetry may be forgiven, and he wrote one line, even good Homer notes. Even good Homer, the writer of Iliad and Odyssey, had some faults also. He said, avoid faults as much as you can, and you seek models in nature. He said, nature cannot betray anyone. Now I can remember one line from William Wordsworth's poem, Tintern Abbey, where he wrote, nature never did betray the heart that loved her. Poetry for him is not inspiration but perspiration. Means it is the result. Poetry is the result of exercise. It is not the God's giving and you are writing. It is not that matter to him. Poetry has great power and appeal. And he said great poets are great prophets. And he said poets are the philosophers and the first instructors of the men of the human of the world, first instructors, teachers of the world. And here we can remember Philip Sidney's opinion, same opinion in his writing. He ends this writing with the example of a Sicilian poet named Empedocles, and he was the mad poet. And that Empedocles was a Pythagorean. He was a follower of Pythagoras, and he leaped into Etna, that is a volcano, in cold blood in 5th century BC. It is the satirical portraying, and Empedocles thought himself a god, and he desired that his disappearance should not be known clearly to the people, and his death must be remain in a mystery. And this is why he did this, leaving his sandal beside that. He ended the writing by giving the idea that idea of poetic madness or inspiration is absurd. A poet relies on mere inspiration is laughed at by all like a mad poet, and that poet, I said, Empedocles. He gave the example of Empedocles. I am reading last lines of his writing only to show how he ended this poem. But they are all most visibly possessed, and like a baited bear when he breaks loose, without distinction seize on all they meet, none ever escaped that came within their reach, sticking like leashes till they burst with blood, without remorse insatiably they raid, and never live till they have read men dead. Discussed 3 parts. Later critics invented some limitations.
Influenced by Horace, later Alexander Pope wrote in his An Essay on Criticism, received his laws and stood convinced 'twas fit who conquered nature should praise over wit. Horace still sums with graceful negligence and without method talks us into sense. Here we get a praise of Horace as well as a little bit of criticism.
Schleicher called it an art of poetry written without art. Some parts are borrowed and not original. For originality, he implies is the making of old things new. He did not say about ultimate problem of poetry and process of poetic creation. This is the major fault of his writing. Atkins, Atkins, Atkins says his writing is faultless. Thank you.